voice with no snark and no attitude, and everybody agreed it was just the facts. That's as far as it went. You hear that kind of facile cliche about what the news used to be like. You hear it all the time. You hear even very smart people assert that that was true about the media in the good old days, and couldn't we just go back to that? The problem with that is if you actually go back and listen to what the news was like in the good old days, it blows that thesis out of the water almost instantly. Take, for example, the dripping sarcasm in this newsreel from the aforementioned good old days.
Peaceful Finland, that distant northern country of lakes and fjords, of sailing ships and summer bathing beaches, has been invaded and bombed. The long crisis of apparently futile negotiation with Moscow has ended in attack by overwhelming power. The reason for this? The Soviet, a nation of some 180 millions, has been threatened by the 4 millions in Finland. The huge Russian air force, probably the biggest in the world, fears for its very existence. And the Red Fleet, no doubt, has been gravely menaced by Finland's 2 or 3 warships. What are the real facts?
The good old days of voice of God authoritative news with no snark, right? That was a 1939 British newsreel, just dripping with sarcasm as to why on earth the Soviet Union felt like it could convince anybody that the reason it needed to invade the neighboring nation of Finland was that Finland was some sort of threat to it, when Finland obviously was no threat. I mean, Soviet Union, just like Putin is claiming about Ukraine now, the Soviet Union did claim that they were somehow in mortal danger from the much, much, much smaller country on their border. This country with a much, much, much smaller military, a country that was doing nothing at all to menace its much larger neighbor to the east. Just like what Putin is saying about Ukraine, the Soviet Union said the same thing about Finland in 1939. But the Soviet army did invade Finland in late 1939. And it appears that their plan was to topple the government in Finland, probably in a matter of a few days. They thought it would not be hard. The Soviet military went in by land, by sea, and by air. They used about 100,000 troops, which is huge. Their military just dwarfed the military force that the Finns had to defend themselves. And their plan was that the Soviet Union would basically just take Finland, install their own puppet pro-Soviet government, or maybe just even annex Finland, make Finland part of the USSR, erase it as a sovereign country. And again, they didn't think it would be hard. They thought it would take maybe a few days. It did not work that way. The Finns in 1939 fought them off furiously. I mean, at the time, there were less than 4 million people in Finland, 180 million people in the Soviet Union, and proportionate militaries to those populations. The Finns were outnumbered, they were wildly outgunned, but they were also resourceful, they were fighting on their own home turf, and they were more motivated than you can possibly imagine. They were defending their homes. That was called the Winter War. It started when the Soviets invaded in late 1939. I'm sure Stalin thought his forces would be home for the new year. Instead, it stretched on into 1940. The Finns wore this remarkable white winter camouflage. They fought on skis and snowshoes, and they just cut down the invading Soviet forces. Finland, in fact, didn't have its own air force at all, but they still managed to shoot down dozens of Soviet airplanes. In one famous battle in central Finland, it was 6,000 Finnish troops versus more than 20,000 Soviet troops, and the Finns just routed them, despite being outnumbered to such a massive extent. The Soviets suffered huge casualties, hundreds of thousands of casualties ultimately in their Finland invasion. And the Western world was shocked. The Western world had thought that the Soviets would have won in just a few days too. I mean, the Soviets thought that, but everybody else looking in thought that. When the Finns put up this unexpected and incredibly effective resistance, they became a cause célèbre all over the United States. Even though our government didn't send them nearly as much practical help as they wanted, we still cheered them on. Well, in the end, although it didn't go the way he expected it to at the beginning, Stalin regrouped. He sent in not another 100,000 Soviet troops, but more like 500,000 Soviet troops to get the job done. The population of Finland was less than 4 million people in the whole country. Stalin had to send in 500,000 troops to finish the invasion in the end. But the Finns still fought. They held their ground for weeks, even after the 500,000 Soviet troops arrived in that second wave of the invasion. The Finns were able to hold on, ultimately, for more than 100 days. And in the end, it did end. The Finnish government was not toppled. They negotiated a peace with the Soviets, and the negotiated settlement was bad for Finland, but it was nowhere near as bad as what Stalin had intended for when he invaded in the first place and just thought he'd run roughshod over the place. In the negotiated settlement that ended the Winter War, Finland did have to cede about 10% of its territory to the Soviets, which is bad. But they stayed Finland. They kept their independence as a nation. They kept their sovereignty. They kept their way of government. They even got to keep their army. They got to stay who they are. And they also never forgot it. And because Russia invaded Ukraine, support has spiked in Finland and also in neighboring Sweden for those two countries to now join NATO. They never wanted to before, but now they do. One of the million different contradictory justifications Putin's given for why he needed to invade Ukraine, one that you often hear parroted by people in this country apologizing for Putin, is this idea that Putin felt cramped by NATO. That too many countries to the west of Russia had joined NATO. They were too close to Russian borders, so he had to invade Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine would never join NATO. He's made this case that the reason for the war, at least one reason for this invasion, is that Putin couldn't stand the feeling of having any NATO countries right up against Russia's borders. Well, congratulations, Mr. Putin. Guess what you got for invading Ukraine? Even if Finland alone joins NATO, you will have just more than doubled the amount of Russian land border with NATO countries. Well done. Sweden's ruling party, the Social Democrats, they've always been against Sweden joining NATO, as has the Swedish public. But now both the Swedish public and that ruling party in Sweden have changed their minds. In Sweden, the Social Democratic Party put out a statement yesterday that said, quote, "When Russia invaded Ukraine, Sweden's security position changed fundamentally." And so even though they have always been opposed to Sweden joining NATO, they're now expected to favor it. And the Swedish government is expected to decide on applying for NATO membership as soon as this summer. Even sooner than that, it looks like Finland is going to make its request to join. And NATO will say yes when these countries ask. One recent poll in Finland shows that even though just a couple of years ago, a majority of the Finnish public didn't want their country to join NATO, since Putin invaded Ukraine, they're sure in favor of it now. The Finnish people are now 68% in favor of joining, and that number spikes to 77% in favor of joining if the Finnish government studies the issue and decides to recommend it. Well, next week, the Finnish government is going to present a security review on this issue to their parliament. A recent survey of members of the Finnish parliament says that of the 200 MPs, they've got the 200 members of parliament, 194 are in favor of Finland joining NATO. That's 194 in favor, 6 against. Which means the Finnish government is going to recommend that they join NATO. And the Finnish public is going to support them. And it's going to pass. And it's going to pass soon, apparently. A former prime minister of Finland tells the AFP this week that it is a foregone conclusion that Finland will request NATO membership, and the request will happen within the next few weeks. It'll happen in time for the next NATO summit in June. Now, Russia has responded by threatening that there's going to be consequences if that happens. Consequences including military consequences if two new nations join NATO. But these aren't just any two countries. I mean, particularly Finland. Since the Winter War in 1940, Finland has been getting ready for those kinds of threats from this country that invaded them before. And at least now is implicitly threatening that they might do it again. Finland is actually remarkably ready for those threats. In Finland, the country maintains secure stockpiles of at least a 6-month supply of all major food grains, things like oats and wheat. They also maintain a 6-month stockpile of all major fuel supplies. They require all pharmaceutical companies in Finland to keep secure stockpiles of several months' worth of all major imported drugs. Every building above a certain size in Finland is required to have a bomb shelter. That's on top of a national plan that repurposes underground parking garage and ice rinks and pools into civilian shelters in the event of invasion. In the country's capital, in Helsinki, they have built 10 million square meters of underground space underneath Helsinki proper. It includes, it's not just like shelters and subway stations, it's an art museum and a church and a huge swimming complex and a mall and a go-karting track. You know, you might need it. Also a huge drinking water reservoir, all underground, all beneath the capital city of Helsinki for safety. One former defense minister in Finland telling the Financial Times this week how, quote, detailed planning is in place for how to handle an invasion, including the deployment of fighter jets to remote roads around the country, the laying of mines in key shipping lanes, the preparation of land defenses such as blowing up bridges. He says, quote, all armed forces headquarters are located in hillsides under 30 to 40 meters of granite. So they're ready. And here we've got Russia failing in Ukraine. They thought they would run roughshod over Ukraine. They thought they would walk in, they'd take Kiev within days. They thought they would decapitate the Ukrainian government and take over the country in less than a week.